No, it's all right.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Yuka Igarashi, managing editor of Granta, and I'm so delighted to be launching After the War here at the Frontline Club tonight with Lindsey Hilsum, Frances Harrison, and Roma Tearne. It's been a really great week for us at Granta. We've won the Booker Prize this week, and we're also thank you. And I like to take credit for that, even though we're the magazine. It's also such a pleasure to launch this very special issue with such experts of the field. Before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to say a few words about our issue. From Patrick French's examination of his family and Britain's military past, to Hari Kunzru's visit to Chernobyl, to Lindsey Hilsum's return to Rwanda, the issue reminds us that what comes after war is not simply peace, but many other things: tourism, secrets, rewritten histories, the creation and inheritance of celebratory oil paintings, trauma, suffering, survival, the difficult work of rebuilding, and often more in different kinds of battles. It's a great issue. It's on sale here tonight at a discounted rate. There's also a special subscription offer. And if you buy a subscription for a year, you'll get this issue for free. So you should take advantage of that. Our panelists, Lindsey Hilsum and Frances Harrison, have years of experience as foreign correspondents in conflict zones around the world. It is a unique privilege to have them here to discuss what it's like to write about post-conflict situations and what particular challenges they face reporting and writing into that space. To the very left, or is it right? To the very right is Lindsey Hilsum, who is international editor for Channel 4 News and has covered major conflicts and international events of the past 2 decades. She spent most of 2011 reporting on the Arab Spring, primarily in Libya, but also in Egypt and Bahrain, and is the author of Sandstorm, Libya in the Time of Revolution. In 1994, she was the only English-speaking foreign correspondent in Rwanda when the genocide began. For the rainy season, our lead piece in the issue, she returns to see what the country is going through 20 years later. Frances Harrison, who's next to Lindsey, has worked for many years as a foreign correspondent for the BBC and posted to South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Iran. From 2000 to 2004, she was a resident BBC correspondent in Sri Lanka and has worked at Amnesty International as head of news. Her book, Still Counting the Dead, Survivors of Sri Lanka's Hidden War, published by Granta Books, recounts the suffering of Sri Lankan civil Tamil population during the final chapter of the Sri Lankan Civil War. Right now, she has a powerful piece up on Granta Online that profiles one of the survivors of that war. Our chair is Roma Tearne, who is a Sri Lankan-born artist, filmmaker, and novelist. She has published 5 novels. Her most recent one, The Road To Urbino, was longlisted for the Man Asian Prize. We're very grateful to Roma, who stepped into the event at short notice when our moderator fell sick. And thank you for being perfect for this occasion, and as well as healthy.
So far.
Please give all 3 of them a warm welcome. Also, if you could turn off all your cell phones or put them silent, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Lindsey is associated with the trouble spots and ravaged areas of conflict around the world. A mutual friend once joked, "Where are you off to next, Lindsey?" Just so we know to avoid that place. Like Don McCullum, the war photographer, you know if Lindsey is present, it's serious. I know her writing, of course, because I read Sandstorm. And when she first told me she was going back to Rwanda, I assumed a book on the subject, recounting what had happened there, was in the offing. Instead, her piece for Granta, written after an absence of 19 years, takes an altogether different view. I'd like to ask her to read a little bit from the piece.
Thank you, Roma. I'm going to read just the first few paragraphs. After 94, I had gone back several times, but I didn't, for the last 10 years, I haven't been back at all. And that was partly because because I couldn't face it. So Granta, I suppose, gave me the opportunity to face it again. And this is how the piece starts. For years, the rainy season would bring up bodies that had lain where they were slaughtered. You might see clothes floating in a flooded field, or stumble across a leg bone or a child's skull, half covered in mud. Nowadays, the rain lifts memories to the surface. It beats down on iron roofs like a manic drum, conjuring demons that Rwandans suppress for the rest of the year. Pastors, counsellors and doctors open their doors to find people they haven't seen for months, complaining of non-specific pains and worries, sleeplessness and headaches. Rain pitches them back to the second week of April 1994, when the sky opened up like a vast cataract and the killing began. My own memories of that week are fragmented like a reel of old film with frames missing. I can see a truck loaded with bleeding bodies driving at speed through the gates of a hospital in Kigali. Torrential rain washes blood across the yard and down the drains. I remember thinking, this is not a metaphor. The gutters are running red with blood. At first, I believed the images would last forever, but memory is a tricky thing, and the pictures in my head have shifted. Inside the ward, I can see a woman holding a baby whose arm has been chopped off with a machete. Or is it a leg? She is wandering around trying to get a nurse to pay attention, but the hospital is so full of grievously injured patients that no one is listening. Some frames remain clear and frozen despite the passing years. Flies buzz over 4 women with their throats cut outside a clinic in the Kigali suburb of Gikondo. A soldier leans on his AK-47 on the path outside my house. Tracers arc through the night sky. The gunfire stops. The rain eases. And there is silence. I was living in Kigali when the massacre started, working for UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund. Having previously been a journalist, I began to report for newspapers and radio, but it was not like other assignments where you go in search of the story. The story erupted around me. In the years that followed, I spent many months in Rwanda. Each time I left, I found it harder to return. I was mired in that week, unable to subsume my feelings of guilt for having witnessed the horror without immediately understanding what it meant and why it was happening. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives were lost before I realized that I was witnessing not simply mass murder, but genocide.
Thank you. Francis Harrison writes about Sri Lanka's war in midstream as events unfold. The stories she tells are deceptively simple, the sting in them unexpected, the power and the pity behind them totally uncompromising. When I first read the book, when it was sent to me, in review copy, I cried. As a Sri Lankan, I had not read a clearer account of what was going on in my country. Here was a modern-day paradise that had been lost, presented without the softness or the distance of fiction. Could you read us a bit?
I'm going to read a story I've just put online on the Granta site, which is about a girl who lives in London who I met in the last few months. A Tamil girl who's a refugee here, who went through the whole of the last phase of the war, which I describe in my book. And then this is what happened to her after the war. So this is about 6 months after the guns went silent. So I'll just read you an excerpt. It was 4 PM at the main checkpoint by the road going north when a rebel informer recognized Selvi from her time with the Tigers and turned her in. If she ever saw him again, would she want revenge, I wonder? Yes, she says instinctively, it's better he dies for that horrible thing he did to me. Then she reflects sadly on what the informer might have endured to turn traitor on her. Probably the army took his family and said they'd only give them back if he'd identify someone. It was dark by the time the Sri Lankan security forces drove her away, blindfolded in the back of a white van. Many hours passed. The road was straight, then it curved and went up and down gentle hills. Selvi heard hawkers by the roadside calling out in the Sinhala language, which meant she was being taken out of the Tamil north of the island. Eventually, the vehicle was driven inside a building. Like other detainees, Selvi never saw the outside of the place where she was held. There was no window in her padlocked room, but every day she heard female voices screaming and crying in Tamil. "We don't know anything," they cried. "Help me, save me, mother." She never saw another detainee or a woman guard. It was only men in uniform and civilian dress from the majority Sinhalese community. On the first night, the interrogation started. They asked her about her time with the rebels. "Do you know this man? Do you know this woman? When did you join?" they wanted to know, as they beat, pushed, kicked, and shouted abuse at her. She was handed photographs to identify. They whipped her with a leather belt. She was burned on her body with hot metal rods and with lit cigarettes on her legs, breasts, and back. There are now at least 100 documented cases in the UK alone of Sri Lankans who've been branded with hot metal rods, and almost every torture survivor has cigarette burns. One Sri Lankan man described his torture as casually extinguishing their cigarettes on his body as if it were an ashtray. Others recall the torturer puffing hard on the cigarette stub first to make sure it was burning brightly in order to burn the flesh more. By the second day, Selvi had signed a confession she wasn't allowed to read, but that didn't stop the abuse. After she'd confessed, a succession of men repeatedly raped her. So many men in uniform and civil dress, many different men, she says, unable to remember how many times she was raped because it happened so frequently over the months. They didn't rape her in the hope of securing information. There were no questions. Most of the time, the soldiers shouted at her, but she couldn't understand what they were saying in their language. Selvi contemplated suicide because she couldn't imagine coming out alive. The only reason she didn't kill herself was the lack of resources to do so. When she was taken once a week to shower, the guards submerged her head in water to suffocate her. She endured 4 months in that secret detention centre, being raped and humiliated, before her uncle found her through a pro-government Tamil paramilitary group and arranged to pay a bribe for her release. Every single person I've met who's been abducted in Sri Lanka's notorious white vans has escaped only because a relative paid a large bribe to the security forces. It's rapidly becoming a torture industry.
Thank you. When I was asked to chair this at the 11th hour, I remembered something that I'd read a long time ago. It was a small quotation, and I went in search of it because I felt it was appropriate to this evening. And this is the quotation. "History repeats itself, but the special call of a victim of a war that has passed away can never be reproduced. It is utterly gone out of the world, as the song of a destroyed wild bird." That quotation comes from something that was written in 1906 by Joseph Conrad. And I'd just like to say to both of you that I feel that in your different and remarkable ways, you stand up for that song of that destroyed wild bird. And you are both conservationists of the human being. And you understand, and you wish to understand, that in the struggle between memory and forgetting, it seems to be that it's the latter that appears to be winning. So I want to ask you this question. We know that memory clings on in a very, very fragile way, but how do we keep it fully alive? Can this only be done in an individual fragmentary way, or is it possible to do it collectively, as a collective experience? And if so, how?
I personally feel that it's very important to tell the stories of the defeated, of the losers of a war, and obviously that's what I've done. And I think there are a number of different ways you can do it. I mean, you do it in fiction. There are people who are doing a play out of the book I've written. There are people who've written very, very powerful poetry. And I think poetry actually captures the raw pain, the instant raw pain, better than prose. So there are different mediums you can use, and I think they're incredibly important in reaching different sorts of people. But I did struggle to capture, in the book I wrote about the war, to capture the horror of something like that. I think it is very difficult to bring that back to life.
So you think that the first thing that has to be done to preserve memory is to is to talk about things like the torture and...
Well, I'm a journalist, so I guess, the first thing I want to do is tell the story of what happened. And with the war that I've been working on, the story wasn't properly reported at the time for a number of different reasons.
So getting the facts right.
The facts, and I think when you don't have independent witnesses, then you go to look at individual testimonies and corroborate those with facts.
Yes.
You do have.
Yes. Lindsey, how do you, because you've written about memory in this piece, in a quite sort of fluid way, what do you think can be done about memory?
Well, memory is a very complicated thing because people to some extent remember what they want to remember. And in Rwanda, people's memories conflict. And so what the government has done is it has tried to establish a version of memory which will be agreed on whether you like it or not. But their version is full of internal contradictions because the government in Rwanda, basically, as most of you I'm sure will know, that the genocide was primarily Hutus, the majority population, whose leaders got them to massacre their Tutsi neighbours, the Tutsis being the minority. And this was stopped when an army of Tutsi exiles came in from Uganda. Those Tutsi exiles now run the government. Now, what I have just said is not allowed to be said, because there is no Hutu and there is no Tutsi in Rwanda. That's what the government tells us. There are only Rwandans. And on the one hand, that's a good thing. It's a good thing not to talk up and reinforce these divisions, which are not really tribal, they're more social, they're very complex, but it's better not to talk them up because that was what caused the problem in the first place. But on the other hand, if you pretend it's not there, what does that do? So the ethnographic museum in Butare, which I went to, it's the only ethnographic museum I've ever been to in the world which makes no mention of ethnicity. There are no, there's endless gourds and there's ancient weapons and there's things that people used to wear and a model of a hut that people might have lived in the 18th century, and they've got all of that. I went through 7 rooms of spears and beaded jewellery in search of any reference to Hutu, Tutsi or Twa. Let's not forget the pygmy Twa. Not there.
So it's not working?
Yes, it's working. It's working in that people are not killing each other in the way that they used to. It's working in the sense that I think that there is some kind of national consciousness, but it's not working because everybody has their individual memories, and people's individual memories are being suppressed by the state. And I actually don't know, in the end, whether that's good or bad.
Because one of the things you say, somebody says to you, "Today we don't agree that there are differences," he replied. "If you want to heal the nation, you cannot write that. So you cannot write about differences."
You can't write about differences. And that is both good and bad, because you don't want people sitting there saying things, and, in the time I was there, people mentioned this concept, let's finish the job. Let's finish the job. Let's exterminate all the Tutsis. You don't want people to be able to say that in the same way as we have a law here against incitement to racial hatred. I think that's fine. I don't think people should be able to get up and incite people to racial hatred. But, and in a place where you've had a genocide, fair, even more acute, but it's what happens under the surface. And it's still there. It's under the surface.
Well, this is very similar, of course, to Sri Lanka. So what do you
Well, I think it's the language and the terms you use shape the reality to a certain extent. So, obviously now Sri Lanka says they didn't have an ethnic war, they had a terrorist war, a war against terrorists, right? It wasn't about Sinhalese and Tamils much in the same sort of way. It was about eradicating the horrible terrorists who happened to be Tamil. And I think this argument over language, it comes up again and again. I mean, I've had people saying to me, "Why do you call them Sri Lankan Tamils in your book? You should call them Elam Tamils," which is quite an abstruse point about the separate state they wanted, which was Elam. So, yes, there is there's a degree to which the terminology you use shapes the reality and people's conception of it, and it is extremely sensitive.
But it's kind of more than the language, isn't it? It's about
In Sri Lanka,
traditions.
it's also about denial of
yes.
what actually happened.
But presumably this is the same in Rwanda.
No, it's not the same. There is no no. The government certainly does not deny what happens. In fact, the government's raison d'être is that it was this army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, they were the ones who put an end to the genocide, unlike the useless international community and the United Nations, which did bugger all. So that's their whole legitimacy, and that's what the essence of the contradiction is. That if you go to the Genocide Museum in Kigali, it's full of Tutsis and Hutus and mentions them, because it's about how this genocide was ended. And so that there's this complicated thing between what happened and acknowledging what happened, and then trying to pretend those feelings have gone away and we don't have to talk about those divisions in order to move forward.
But I mean, what I found quite interesting personally, reading your piece, was that I heard within that piece things that young Sri Lankans, and I mean Sri Lankans, both Sinhalese and Tamils, say, so quite often the diaspora, and they say, well, there is no problem now. We all get on. Some of my best friends are Tamils, you know? And so this is not just a governmental thing. This is a way of dealing, presumably, with a civil war. But what you're actually saying...
But there's a difference, Roma, because the difference is that in Rwanda, the victims won, as it were.
Yeah.
Or the people who championed the victims won. Whereas in Sri Lanka, it was the other way around.
Lost.
So that's an essential
difference. But how do you see this moving into a situation where each side can acknowledge their anger about what has happened collectively in a way that's not dangerous? I mean, that's really what we're talking about, isn't it?
Well, it's acknowledging different narratives of decades of war in Sri Lanka, and that's extremely difficult, and it's never ever happened even during times of peace. And now the two sides couldn't be further apart, because you've got on the one hand, possibly, tens and tens and tens of thousands of people killed, possibly over 100,000, and on the other side they said zero civilian casualties. So you've got such absolutely divergent accounts of what happened only 4 years ago that until you find some space to get over that, I don't see how you can reconcile.
And do you think this is possible in both cases where, there's a woman or a man in your story where they say, oh, we talk about it when we're alone?
Yes.
But, can it go beyond?
No, but to some extent in Rwanda it has, in that you have this system of gacaca, which are the people's courts. And so through this system of justice, which is rough and ready and not always right, there is some attempt at bringing a collective agreement out, and that is on an individual and a community basis. So, so-and-so is accused of killing somebody else, and this person comes up and is before the court and the community testify and so on. Now, that has enabled people to carry on living together, because there were so many killers in Rwanda, you couldn't put them all in prison. The prisons weren't big enough. The prisons of all of Africa weren't big enough for them. So you had to let some of them go. And this was the method which was chosen. And in some way, it works, and people live alongside each other. But what happens in people's hearts is a whole different thing.
And how do you get over something like what has happened to this girl?
Well, why would you expect anybody to get over it?
Well, you can't expect.
Well, so what kind of views of Germans did I grow up with as the first generation after World War II?
But the problem is, if you can't get over it, if it's simmering under the surface, what happens then in Sri Lanka?
I mean, that girl, for me, was actually a survivor compared to the others I've met. She's much stronger, much more resilient. She's somebody who gives the appearance of being happy when she doesn't talk about this. So she's got married, she has a job. That's quite an achievement.
Sure.
Huge achievement.
After this, a huge
It
achievement.
is a big.
Yeah,
It's a big,
I found her actually very inspirational.
I mean, there have been other girls, haven't there, that we know of who.
So I found myself wanting to tell the others about her, because her future was, her situation was much better. But obviously, in a sense, you never get over that kind of thing. And other torture survivors you see from this war and others really are destroyed for life. And that's the intention.
And the problem is there, isn't it? Because if a country is truly going to move on, that's all got to be sifted through and dealt with in some way.
Well, what the Rwandan government would say is that the answer is development.
Right.
And there has been development, and it's good.
I think the Sri Lankan government would agree with you.
Yes, that's what they would say too.
All governments agree
All
with that,
governments
yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Let's get on.
Okay.
Let's build more roads. That's the answer.
Yes,
Roads. They're
yes.
really good.
Okay, so what of the diaspora then from these countries? I'm interested in the diaspora, the Sri Lankan diaspora. That you mention those two boys growing coffee.
Yeah, I mean, the diaspora is, I mean, again, it's, in a sense, it's a reverse situation because in Rwanda, what you had was in 1959, when you had independence, many Tutsis were pushed out, mainly to neighboring countries, to Uganda and Burundi. And so they lived there for 30 years, and it was after the genocide that they came back in, because then Tutsis were no longer suppressed, and that it was possible for them to come home, or they saw it as home. But actually, one of the things which I've really noticed over the years in Rwanda is that the diaspora are like a third ethnic group because they are not like the Tutsis who are survivors. The survivors are the lowest of the low. The survivor women are the ones who are looking after all the orphans. There's usually only one or two Tutsi survivors in a village, and they're poor and they're crushed. And they're not like the Tutsis who came in from Uganda and Burundi. I mean, these people, they're big, they're tall, they're healthy, they're incredibly prosperous. For them, it was a land of opportunity. I can remember 10 years ago when I was there reading a newspaper article, which was it was two lads who'd come in from Uganda on the back of the genocide to make their fortune. And it was like, wow, 10 years ago, remember how it was when we first came here? Wow, it was fantastic. You know, we could do anything. We could set up businesses. And that's what they've done. And they've done incredibly well. It's very good for the country. They have really good small-scale coffee production, which is all run by exiles. Because these people, it's not just that they're big and tall and well-nourished. It's that they're psychologically strong. And the survivors of the Rwandan genocide are not psychologically strong. They can't be. And then you also have this thing which you had with the Jews as well after the Holocaust, which was, how did you survive? What did you do? Who did you sleep with? What compromises did you make? Why are you not dead? Like the only virtuous position to be in was to be dead if you were a Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994. And so there's this kind of tension between the incomers, the incoming diaspora and the survivors. And all of that is swirling around under the surface in Rwanda, very rarely written about or talked about.
Can we sort of use that example as an example in Sri Lanka?
Well, certainly since, broadly speaking, 1983, there's now a huge outflow of Sri Lankan Tamils abroad all over the world. I mean, Canada, UK, Europe, Australia. So there's now probably about 1 million externally, and they funded the LTT during the war. And it's very difficult to categorize them in the way you have in sort of one lump, really, because I think they differ enormously. And of course, you know, they've left since 83. They've left in different waves, and they themselves are refugees from war and have been traumatized at different stages. So they play a different role. I mean, they're fractured, they're fragmented. They were much more pro-LTT when they existed. Now there's much more division, much more argument about what to do next. Certainly the Sri Lankan government would like them to go back to the country and to invest their considerable wealth in the north and east of Sri Lanka.
But I mean, that's interesting, because you're talking about the Tamil diaspora.
Yes.
But I'm talking about the Sri Lankan diaspora.
Well, predominantly it's Tamil, as you know. There are Sinhalese abroad, but they're much smaller in number.
They are smaller, but there are some quite wealthy Sinhalese, some quite educated Sinhalese people abroad who are not joining in and not forming a collective.
I think you just have so few. I think the diaspora is so much smaller that it's less united, and so you get different shades of opinion.
And do you think that if sections of the diaspora did go back and did invest, could it help? Could it help?
Well, some have. I think it's really problematic in terms of their actual safety. You know, a number of the people who are being tortured are people who have some kind of presence in the UK, students who go back after a few years because they think that they want to go and see their dying grandmother or their elderly, parents, and because of their connection in diaspora politics, they get picked up and questioned and sometimes tortured. So I think there are serious issues for security for some of these people who go back. But yes, they could play a role, but I think the problem is the areas where they could go back and play a role are so heavily militarized and there's so little freedom and safety for them that it's not really feasible to expect them to be able to do that properly.
So in a sense, the war is still going on?
Absolutely. But just in a under the surface, invisible sort of a way. It's not really resolved. And you see that from the fact that none of the underlying issues that caused the war have been addressed. There's no political solution that deals with Tamil grievances. There's absolutely no intention of having one. So it's just, we won, you're in your place. And by the way, our version of the story is the official version, so we don't buy your one.
Yes, yes. I'd like to go back to this question of memory. Can we learn anything from the first generation of Jewish people trickling out of the concentration camps?
Well, I think that in Rwanda they have learnt a lot from that. But I think that I think that one of the things that the government learnt is less from the first generation of Jews coming out of the concentration camps and more from the Israeli government, is to make sure that your narrative is the one that dominates. I think that they have learned that very strongly, and to make sure that that version of events gets hammered in. And it's a complicated thing because a lot of it's true. Most of it's true. It's just little bits of it are not so true. And so for example, with the RPF, the Rwanda Patriotic Front, absolutely it was the Tutsis who were the victims. But the RPF also committed atrocities, and we don't talk about that. They will say, oh, yes, there was the occasional, slip-up. But they won't talk about the systematic killing of Hutus as they took over the country. And I know it happened in certain places. So, the main thing they've learned is to control the story.
I mean, there are obvious parallels with Sri Lanka with the Tamil story, and I think being unwilling to criticize some of the actions of the Tamil Tigers. And I know that certain academics really who work in Sri Lanka, who are Tamil themselves, are concerned that, in the immediate aftermath of the war, they heard a lot of stories about government atrocities, but also in the midst of that, stories about atrocities or by crimes and oppression from the LTT themselves, from the Tigers. And they felt that with the passage of time, those memories of crimes by their own side were fading because people forgot about it and they started to, erase that from their memory because they wanted to see them as heroes again now that they were all dead and they had a different oppressor. So, with the passage of time, memory bits and pieces go and get dropped.
I think that's really interesting because you have those sort of inconvenient truths that people don't want because they want the simple story of what happened because they think that will either help them heal or help them keep control.
Well, and I think journalists want its simplicity too.
We love that.
The poor civilians stuck in the middle of the equally awful two sides, and it's not that simple.
Yeah.
Both sides committed war crimes. Well, hold on a minute, 4 years on, there's only one side.
Yeah.
So what can we do then? I mean, is it through art? Is it through literature? Is the truth or is true feeling going to come out through the arts? Is that the only way? Because you're going to have a government either organising it so that, there are no more killings, or a government organising it so that the killings have stopped, but the tourists come in and the torture is going on underneath. So either way, there doesn't seem to be a way of bringing these stories out. So is it art, literature, music? Is that how it's going to come out? Interestingly enough, last year's Venice Biennale, there were no Sri Lankans. There was no Sri Lankan pavilion. I've been asked many times, in fact I was asked tonight, why is this? Why is there no Sri Lankan art or literature on an international level that's coming out? And
well, Rwanda, there isn't really Rwandan either, but there are. It's to do with people telling their own stories. I have a friend who I mentioned in the piece, who's kind of wrestling with all this now he's in fact a diaspora Tutsi who questions everything, and he wrote a very impassioned piece, which was a blog, which the government then stamped down on because he was criticising his own people, and that wasn't allowed. And so now he's trying to write a play, because he sort of feels that in a play, which may be sort of slightly disguised, that's a way that maybe he can express some of these complicated issues about, which are really issues of identity, because he says, you know, if you look at the DNA, 99.97% whatever DNA between Hutus and Tutsis is the same. He says, well, why can't we say that? Why can't we say that we are really the same? But at the same time, he understands very much how socially and culturally what the differences are. He is full of stories, which he told me, of how that comes out in Rwandan society. So he feels that the only way he can express this is through drama. But on the whole, I mean, most of the art that comes out of Rwanda is, you know, it's sort of baskets and women doing that kind of dancing. You know, it doesn't actually tell you a lot about what people really feel. Is they're trying to be, it's like cows, because cows are a big thing. I mean, this is actually a very interesting thing about Rwandan culture, that everybody's into cows, and the dancing that they do is amazing, which sort of everybody has their sort of horns like cows, but anyway.
But I mean, what's kind of interesting
international stage.
no, but listen, if you go to as many Rwandan bloody charity events as I do, you have, I mean, sorry, I can say this in this company, my partner at the back, a new rule came in some years ago, and he just said, no, it wasn't cows, he said, no more Rwandan baskets. No more Rwandan baskets, it's finished. And with the cow dancing, I've seen a lot. Anyway, sorry, go on.
But no, W.G. Sebald, the German writer, said 50 years had to go before German consciousness came up. Would you agree with that? Would you agree with that as a sort of a general rule of thumb for a civil war? Because you're either having a rant, if you're writing straight away, you know, if you're from the country, or you're drawing cows or baskets.
Yes.
And do you think really what's needed is time?
It depends whether they pass it on to the next generation, does it?
Well,
I mean,
won't it?
Israelis and Palestinians, I mean, they've had more than 50 years. And so it depends what happens, doesn't it? It depends what happens politically.
What do you think, Francis?
Well, I know survivors of the war of various shades who've been writing poetry about it. And obviously it's therapeutic in a way for them too, but it's a way of expressing what happened to them. And so I think they've started doing it already.
Yes.
And I think the stories are really important. And the people that I interviewed who've been through the war were not really in a state to write their own stories yet. It was too soon.
It is too soon.
And you know, they didn't want to remember most of that stuff. They suffered enormously in remembering it and telling me, and they had sleepless nights after they met me, and you know, they found it extremely painful. So they weren't in a state to do it yet. But I think the storytelling is incredibly important, and as you know, my book's been translated into Sinhala, into the language of the majority community in Sri Lanka, and pushed out online. And you know, the websites who've been carrying it have received phone calls from Sinhalese people who've said, you know, we're shocked, we're horrified, we didn't know this was happening. This is in a tiny, tiny island, and it's only 4.5 years ago, but they simply didn't know. So I think, you know, that's the first step, that people understand the other narrative, and then perhaps the second step is actually to be able to meet those people if you have a common language and talk, which most of them don't.
Okay, well, I want to ask you one more question before I open it out to everybody to ask whatever they'd like to. And it's a question that I know Lindsey will not be happy with me asking, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And Don McCullen, right, he turned to taking photographs of the English landscape when he gave up on his war photography.
Yes.
So...
Am I going to write a bucolic English pastoral?
No. What? What's the personal cost for both of you? You're not Rwandan, you're not Sri Lankan.
No. Oh, go on, Francis, you go first.
I guess, you know, I was listening to you at the beginning about the sense of guilt.
Yeah.
And I guess in a much more minor way, I also feel that you know, during 2009, by a strange fluke, by a strange coincidence of all the BBC correspondents based in Sri Lanka, I happened to be there at a time when I had most access to the rebel areas, so I got to know them a lot, and all the stories were there. And it just wasn't open before, and it wasn't as open afterwards. And so I knew those people really well. And then I went on and did other stories. I went to Iran. And then during the height of the war, they kept ringing me up, Skyping me, sending me messages, ringing me on their sat phones with bombs dropping behind. And, part of me just wanted not to know. But at the same time, you can't say no to somebody who's in a situation like that. So they kept me hooked. And then more and more people I knew from Sri Lanka claimed asylum here. So I could never get away with it from it. And I also felt slightly guilty that during 2009, when they were ringing up, basically it was a cry for help, and I didn't do anything, or I couldn't think what to do. I did what little I could, but it wasn't enough. And so I felt slightly responsible. It was nagging at me. And so I guess that's part of it. And then the more you know about something, the more privileged you are in terms of access, information, the more connected you are, the more information comes back to you, the more you can never escape it, really. And so you have a moral responsibility to tell people what's happening at the moment. So in terms of personal cost, I always find doing the interviews the worst part. They're actually writing it up or producing something out of it is much more creative. But yes, it's terrible.
Well, I said to Frances yesterday that at some point she has to stop doing this, because there was a point where I stopped doing Rwanda because I couldn't do it any longer, and that was 10 years ago. So I did say to Frances, at some point you must stop, because you can only take so much, and there comes a point where you can't do any more. It just kind of explodes your brain. And I'm lucky, because I have a job, which means that I can go to all sorts of different places. And if there comes a point where I sort of can't do the kind of either the dodgy stuff or the miserable stuff, I'm going to Washington next week for a couple of weeks. I have a variety in my life, and that's good, because it gives you some kind of balance and other things. But I suppose I always say, to me, I think I'm a reasonably cheerful person. Normally, psychologically, I'm fine, but philosophically, I'm a basket case. So, philosophically, I think that humankind is not perfectible. I'm not wildly keen about humankind. If you ask...
Never came across the lips of any of the people on the
Yes, it did. Gachacha, I talked about the local trials.
Well, sort of. But the issue really is the South African experience was to, as you know, have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And its great failing was it was not a Truth and Justice and Reconciliation Commission. I wonder whether you'd comment on that road forward in both of the countries.
Yeah. Well, I think that the Gachacha trials, which I mentioned, which were the sort of local justice system, which is partly a traditional justice system, to some extent fulfilled that role in a slightly different way, because you've had three different layers of justice when it comes to Rwanda. You've had the International Criminal Tribunal on Rwanda in Arusha, which has tried, in fact, the majority of the leaders, the government leaders, the ministers and so on, and some mayors, and that's, people feel differently about it. It's had a mixed record. The Rwandan government doesn't like it. But in other ways, it hasn't done badly, particularly compared to other tribunals. And then you had some formal justice system, and then you had this local justice system, which has enabled some kind of truth, and I'm not sure about reconciliation within villages, because people have got up and said what happened to them. People have had the chance to have their say. And I think that has been important, and I think it has made a difference. But, as I explain in the book, I try to sort of talk to some of the people who've been through that system, both victims and perpetrators, and you still come across this knotty problem, which is that at the end, people are still defending themselves. And that's the problem that you have.
Well, it's interesting because the Sri Lankan government's actually talking about potentially one day a truth and reconciliation process that might be, in some way, South Africa might play an advisory role. And there's quite a bit of skepticism about that on the Tamil side because of the lack of truth, let alone justice and reconciliation. Certainly if you talk to any of the survivors of the war or post-war abuses, they have absolutely no hope in any kind of justice system internally inside the country. And I think the international community is waiting to see if there will be some sort of accountability inside Sri Lanka, and that hasn't happened. And we have UN resolutions periodically demanding more accountability, but really I think a lack of international will to push it that hard. And that's where certainly the victims think that, or the Tamil victims, of course there are Sinhalese victims in this war too, certainly Tamils think that it's the international community that will ultimately deliver it, but that could be a very long way.
But you've also got a basic thing, you've got the same government in power.
Yes,
I mean, that's
you've got
that's
no
the main thing. There's no
transitional
transition.
justice.
So until you have some kind of political change, you
It's
can't
going to
really
be
go there,
difficult.
can you?
Not really, unless it's external and there's no will for that. And I mean, certainly this girl I wrote about, Selvi, I asked her if she thought the people who did that to her would ever get, any punished in any way, and she was absolutely adamant, never, no way. And that's the same thing you hear again and again.
Anybody else?
One thing I want to say, you're going to Washington next week, you said.
Yes.
And so you're going yet to another war zone.
No, they solved the war yesterday. They solved the war, which thank God, because I can't add up, I'm innumerate.
Yeah.
And I thought if I have to report on anything to do with a fiscal cliff, I'm just going to fall off it.
It's only temporary. It's really still quite a war
Oh,
zone.
shit.
So it's a real horror. But the bodies are in their houses. They're not out on the streets, so you don't see them. They're just these malnourished people.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to raise a few thoughts and ask a few questions. Sometimes I think that instead of reconciliation commissions, there ought to be coexistence commissions. Because I think that, like for me personally, I know that if someone had murdered one of my family members, I work in the human security peace building field and teach, and I have to teach about forgiveness and reconciliation. But I just let's be frank.
Yeah.
If someone even so much as broke an arm of one of my family members, that would there would never be the kind of forgiveness that I end up teaching, right? So,
You're in an interesting situation.
yeah, because I would be full of anger and even and so but with coexistence, it seems to me what can happen is that communities can start working together on projects, and I think there is something about development that can sometimes be very useful in that way. And
You should buy this book because
I did
write
already.
quite a lot about that at the end of my piece. Anyway, go on, yes.
Oh, good. Yeah,
Yeah.
I actually just
Oh,
bought
good.
it, and I think you're going to sign it, I hope.
All right, good. Yes, anyway, go on, yes.
And so I think that what conceivably could happen in terms of, looking at the long term, looking over 25 to 50 to 75 years, is that you can have first generations who have gone through this horror somehow ending up managing to do a certain amount of coexistence, certain amount of projects, certain amount of, like that kind of Israeli-Palestinian desalinization programs that they used to have a while back that were rather effective. And then individuals meet individuals and their kids end up playing together. And then it's the next generations who can get into reconciliation. And this isn't taught enough in the academic peace building programs. They go right to reconciliation. And I just think that there's, that's not a truth. In my view. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another, I think with memory, I feel as though with memory, there are some people, there are some cases where we only want to remember certain things, we remember what we want. But there are other cases where people have been brutally stung by events, especially in an armed conflict, where our memories are tyrannical. Memory is a tyrant. And we will relive things over and over and over, and we can't get past that memory. And that holds us back from being as fully human as we want to be, as fully free or as fully healed as we want to be. And that's, of course, true in all areas, not just in war-related areas. That could be true because of a natural disaster. It could be true from any loss. It could be true from family conflict. So I think about the tyranny of memory in juxtaposition to the desire for forgetfulness sometimes. And so these were just sort of thoughts that I was having while all of you were speaking. I mean, this is so fascinating. And the last thing is a question I want to ask, and that is, you know, in Rwanda, there was a lot of information about radio programs or a particular radio station that somehow contributed to triggering the armed conflict and the genocide. And so I think it would be really interesting for us to hear a little bit about your views on how media and the press contribute to war and contribute to making peace.
Okay. And I think the second point you made was very interesting. When I was thinking about writing this piece, one of the lines I scribbled down was about memory, forgetting, and making things up, because I think a lot of it is about that. And I actually agree with you. I think a bit of forgetting is a good thing. If it's possible, a bit of forgetting goes a long way, as well as all this memorial stuff. Yeah, I mean, media is really important. One of the main places where this has come out recently is Kenya, because in the 2007 elections, there was a lot of hate speech on radio, which people felt mirrored what had happened in Rwanda with Radio Mille Collines, which many of you will be aware of, was the radio station that preached genocide. But then in the last Kenyan elections, because of all that, everybody was terrified of saying anything. And so the last Kenyan elections, earlier this year, passed with... And it wasn't just that there wasn't hate speech, that's a good thing. There was almost no speech at all. Nobody criticised anything because everyone was so terrified that they were going to be accused of hate speech if they said, you know, that bastard is cheating. And so, you know, it's really difficult because, of course, you want laws against hate speech and incitement. But at the same time, you don't want to stop the freedom of the press, which you had in Kenya very well for many years, and yet that's what's happening. People are finding their way through that, so it's a struggle.
Well, the press is an issue, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, a large number of Sri Lankan journalists, Sinhalese and Tamil, who were reporting on the war, the kinds of ones who would have pushed the limits a bit, are now in exile. You know, scores of them, I would say probably somewhere around 40 or 50. And they left at the last phases of the war because they were, you know, they received death threats. So it was a very deliberate attempt to make sure that it wasn't reported. I mean, I would hear from former colleagues about the dead and the injured being brought in buses where the windows were blacked out, not in ambulances, so the local people wouldn't know what the casualties were on their side, let alone on the other side. So, you know, the control of information, as you know, in a war is incredibly important. And the war zone in Sri Lanka in the last 6 months was off limits to aid workers, you know, international aid workers, and so UN pulled out, and also any kind of local journalists. So there was no international witness or external witness to what went on, and that was very deliberate. It was about controlling the information.
Okay.
Can you think of a setting in which you feel post-conflict journalism has powerfully influenced what happened next, either positively or negatively?
Ooh.
Well, Channel 4's reporting on Sri Lanka, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, and I can boast about it because I had absolutely nothing to do with it. So, but my colleagues did pursue the Sri Lanka story in a way that no other broadcaster and no newspaper did, and really just kept hammering away at finding out what's happened. But has it had an impact, Francis?
I think it's meant that people know a lot more. Yes, it's had an impact probably at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. It hasn't actually made a huge difference
on the
to people on
ground.
the ground, probably. In fact, may have made their lives more difficult because people are constantly being threatened and harassed. So you gave information to Channel 4, you know, that kind of thing. But it certainly had a huge impact on people's awareness. Definitely.
But I think it comes back to what Roma was saying, that really what makes the difference in the end is people in their own communities and their own societies expressing themselves. That's what makes the difference, isn't it? That when people feel that they can express themselves and they can tell the stories of what happened. And that's the real issue. You know, one of the Human Rights Watch report on Rwanda was called Leave None to Tell the Tale. And, you know, that was such an important thing, that nobody should be able to say what happened. Well, they failed. And many people were left in Rwanda who could tell the tale. But that's the issue, isn't it? That people being able to tell their own stories, I think that's much more important than anything that we do.
Well, you need that's both, the problem with Sri Lanka is that even people, I mean, the people I interviewed were all in exile, and most of them wanted to disguise their identity, not because they necessarily felt unsafe in Europe, it was because of their extended families back home.
Yeah.
And that's still very, very much the case, that people don't want to come out with their faces and say, okay, I was there, I saw this, 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 this. You'll find even on the Channel 4 film, many of them don't come with their, you know, their face showing to say what happened to them. So, you know, that's still a problem, that 4.5 years later, you can't come and say, I was in the war and I saw this. Isn't that extraordinary?
Yeah, absolutely.
Should we take one more question? Okay, you after.
Do you ever miss it?
Do you ever miss it? Covering wars, do you mean?
The place. Well, that was the title of Anthony Lloyd's book about Bosnia, wasn't it? My War, I Loved It So. And do I miss Rwanda? No. Sorry. No, I don't. I don't miss Rwanda. And I still go to lots and lots of wars.
Not really relevant to me, I think.
You've both talked about your writing countering a domestic political narrative about the war, but you're also writing for a primarily Western audience, which has its own narrative about what those conflicts both mean, particularly, say, in regard to the war on terror. And I wondered if you could just comment on that and how you position yourselves in regards to those debates and that political discourse about conflict.
Yes, well, I mean, the Sri Lankan government very adeptly used the whole war on terror argument in what was actually an ethnic conflict primarily, and did that at a point when the war on terror is kind of rapidly going out of fashion in the West. And they now, of course, boast that theirs is the only successful defeat of terrorism militarily, which is extraordinary. I think, you know, the other thing that was very important in my book to look at was the role of the international community in the form of the United Nations, because we now know from their own internal inquiry report into Sri Lanka, which referenced Rwanda, that they made grave, you know, there were grave failures on the part of the UN, and they've conceded that. But at the time when I was writing the book, I was tracking down different people who worked for the UN, Sri Lankan Tamils, but also expatriates, who were deeply traumatized by what they'd been through and what they felt was the organization's failure. And certainly for the Tamils who were left behind in the war zone, they'd expected the international community, which for them was symbolized by the UN, Red Cross, US, it was all one kind of thing for them. They expected them to come and save them. They thought there would be some kind of humanitarian rescue operation right up to the end, even when it was clear it was not going to happen. They still hung on to that. So they feel bitterly, bitterly disappointed by the UN and the international community. They feel that they were left to die on the beach, and it was the world that forgot them. So looking at that role of the UN and its failures was very important, because they didn't learn the lessons of Rwanda, and they admit that now.
Well, I would say, internationally, I mean, the sort of any hatred or enmity between Hutus and Tutsis is as nothing compared to the hatred and enmity between academics who write on Rwanda. Right. And human rights people as well. I mean, you know, their version of events and who was right, and it's just absolutely extraordinary. And so one of the things, and that is one of the reasons why I withdrew about 10 years ago, was because I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear it any longer. I couldn't bear the foreigners who told me that that I was bad and wrong, and that I was responsible for genocide because I hadn't understood what was going on early enough. And that because I didn't 100% support the government of Rwanda, that put me as, then I was a genocide denier, and all of this kind of stuff, none of which ever came from Rwandans, all of which came from foreigners. So I have found all that quite difficult. And I think that, so one of the reasons for writing this was not to talk to any bloody foreigners. It's just to try and talk to Rwandans and try and understand as best I can from the Rwandans I know and I care about how it feels and what it means to them. And I am a foreigner, and that's the way it is. I would never pretend to be anything else. But what I want to do is try and understand what Rwandans, many of whom don't speak French or English, or who can't put their stories out to a wider world, to in some ways be, I suppose, a cipher for them, and to try and understand and try and ignore a lot of the chatter which goes on, mainly political, about who supports the government, who doesn't support the government, and who thinks President Kagame is a hero and who thinks he's a devil, and all of this, just to get away from that completely and try and go back to where I started, which was, a hapless person who happened to be living in Rwanda when the genocide started.
I think it's probably a good moment to stop.
Am I going to read my poem?
Lindsey Hilsum, Francis Harrison, thank you very much. Buy the book.
Yeah.
Yes, right, no,
the poem. Doesn't matter, forget it.
do you want to read it? Yeah, read it. Go on.
Before we stop, I just found this absolutely brilliant poem the other day, which is by a Polish writer who I can't pronounce because I don't speak Polish, but I think it's Wisława Szymborska. Anyway, she is called The End and the Beginning, and I just think it says everything. I don't know why we've been banging on for the last hour, because this woman says everything about after the war in this poem. After every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagons can pass. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass and bloody rags. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall. Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. Photogenic it's not, and takes years. All the cameras have left for another war. We'll need the bridges back and new railway stations. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with unsevered head. But already there are those nearby starting to mill about who will find it dull. From out of the bushes, sometimes someone still unearths rusted out arguments and carries them to the garbage pile. Those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who know little and less than little. And finally, as little as nothing. In the grass that has overgrown causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. Isn't that brilliant?